Hi, Terry.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, Terry.
Hi.
Hi, Charlotte. Hi, can't see you, but no, you're there. Hi, Roger.
Yeah.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi, Lindsay.
Good evening, it's Donna here. I'm still watching the inauguration. I'm gonna watch it.
Yeah.
Yay, finally.
Hi, Sophie.
I can't see anyone at the moment.
C'est you.
Mike,
Ouais, on peut te voir.
si je te vois. Right.
That means we've got to start, doesn't it?
Give it a couple of minutes, just a couple of minutes to the hour.
Yeah, it looks like there's still quite a few people to join, doesn't it?
Yeah, they're coming in now.
Yeah.
Mm.
It was billed as being 8 o'clock, wasn't it, rather than 7:45 for 8. So I imagine that people will be just joining.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Jules.
Hi there. Found the phone.
Hey.
Hi,
Intact?
Jules.
Was it intact?
Yes, it was. Absolutely. Yeah. So all good.
Excellent.
It's strange what a couple of days without a phone is. You're like, oh,
Yeah.
Hi, Mary.
How many are you expecting?
Hi, Anne. We had, I think, about 30, didn't we?
Yeah.
So we've got 21 so far, Nicola. Do you think we should wait another minute or?
Yeah, I guess give it another minute. What do you think, Satnam?
Yeah, literally, just let it go for 1 minute, then we'll have to start. Okay, let's go for it.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. For those of you who don't know, I'm Andrea Smith and I'm co-secretary of Watlington Climate Action Group. And I'm sort of hosting tonight because Alistair was my connection through a friend of mine. And we're very lucky to have him come and speak for us as part of our sort of launch of our new project on homes and energy. And just to say a little bit about Alistair Dutton, he is an offshore wind expert of international renown with extensive background in the energy industry, having spent 20 years working in I think not necessarily all offshore wind, but certainly in energy related matters. And in the last 3 years, he says on his LinkedIn profile, he's actually advised 29 different countries on their offshore wind development. So he's also recognized as an expert by the International Energy Agency, the International Renewable Energy Agency, the UK government, the World Bank, and the global, the GWEG. I've forgotten what that stands for, but I'm sure Alistair will remind us of that. But without any further ado, let's listen to what Alistair has to say.
Isn't it strange listening to your own LinkedIn page? So GWEC or GWEC is the Global Wind Energy Council. So you've done much of my history. I won't bore you with it all. The thing I would just take you back to is when I was 15, so not long ago. And the reason that I moved into energy in the first place was the oil crisis of 1973. I just remember my father queuing for petrol for 3 hours to get half a tank. And then a couple of years later, we had the power strikes, and Blue Peter would teach you how to make a candle out of oil and water in a jam jar. I just thought it was nuts. Something needed to be done about it. And the 15-year-old in me said, I'm going to do something. So I have a degree in energy. I moved into energy efficiency. And then I decided renewable energy was where I really wanted to be. And offshore wind was definitely it. So enough about me. I'm going to bring up some slides. I'm going to move through them quite quickly. We'll take questions at the end, unless there's something you're desperate to ask. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
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 Oh, that's good. That's good. Advent.re is my one-man consultancy. Don't worry about it, but it appears on lots of slides. So here you've got an offshore wind turbine. The yellow bit at the bottom is called the transition piece, and it's the bit you don't want to bump into at sea level. And then the rest of the turbine is very similar, but different to the turbines you see onshore. So trying to get a picture of an offshore wind farm is incredibly difficult because they're so big. This happens to be the project called Thanet, which is off the Kent coast. And you can see the layout. We're talking about something like 1 kilometre between each of the turbines. And then the yellow box in the middle is the substation where all the wires come in before the power is exported to land and connects into the grid. And for those of you who've got a very good eyesight, you can just see another wind farm right at the top, and that is called the London Array, which at one point was the largest offshore wind farm in the world. Now I'm going to try and be clever here and play a video, which I haven't done on Zoom before. Let's see how it works. I've got a feeling I'm going to have to switch my share. Where'd it come? There it is. And then if I maximize that. So here's an offshore wind farm connected to shore, and we'll just skip through this a little bit. So I'll start at the beginning. That would be good. Right. This is just to show the construction of an offshore wind farm, and it happens to be sponsored by Siemens. So because it's their turbines. So I'll talk to this rather than play you their music. So we're at the construction port. These are very large ports. Here is a transition piece being lifted onto the vessel. Those brown tubes are the monopiles, which will be driven into the seabed to make the turbine stable. And then the vessel goes out, as you can see. Now, don't be confused by the brown tubes that are sticking up, the 4. You'll see what happens to those in a moment. In fact, here we are. So we're now at the site, and the whole vessel lifts itself out of the ground. So it's a nice, stable platform to hammer the monopiles into the seabed. This is all happening at fast speed. It takes a bit longer than this. So the transition piece is a bit like the cap on a pen, and it's just a nice preparation for the turbine. And off they go to do some more foundations. So we call these fixed foundations. Then either the same vessel or another vessel goes to collect the turbine pieces. You're trying to have the minimum number of lifts offshore because every lift creates some risk. Onshore, you do it in more modular fashion. And they're just lifting the nacelles into place, and that contains the generator. You can see the blades have also been put onto the vessel, and same thing, it lifts itself out of the water, and then using some special clasps, you can start to lift these components out. Now that tower is probably about 120 meters high. And this takes great skill, given that we're offshore and the weather can be quite nasty. In fact, one of the big issues is when do you go offshore or whether you stay in port. And we'll pick that up a little bit on the operation side as well. So they lift the nacelle into place. There are people now bolting that into, it doesn't just sit there. There's an awful lot of bolts, I think 4,000 or something, in a classic construction like this. And then similarly, a special connection to lift the blades into place. And bear in mind, you put offshore wind farms where it's windy. This is actually an incredibly reliable, you can do this installation even when it's very windy because of the techniques that people have now adopted. And there is a motor in the turbines to allow you to move round. And also, if there is no wind, you would turn the turbine just a little every now and then to stop the bearings getting flattened or getting flat edges. And there you go. You've got yourself an offshore wind farm. In a moment, it'll show you how the cables are connected. Oh, one substation. So then the separate turbines are connected in what's called strings of cables that are then connected to the substation, where the voltage is lifted before sending to shore and then connected into the grid itself. Right, enough of that. See if I can get myself back to the presentation. There we are. So why offshore wind? It's like other forms of mining. You want to go to the mother lode, the best version of it. And offshore, the wind is stronger, it's straighter. And since power is related to the cube of the wind speed, that's exactly where you want to be. Lots more power. You can build at much larger scale. We'll touch on that again. And much larger turbines. So that we're seeing projects now, I've mentioned 300 to 1500 megawatts. We ought to touch on what's a megawatt. So a kilowatt would be, if you remember, 1 bar electric fires. And then a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. And we'll mention gigawatts in a moment, which is 1,000 megawatts. Lots. The other is that whilst they're larger, you 25 to 35%, and compare it with PV, which in the UK is only 11%. There's lots of wind. We happen to be next to the Atlantic. We have spectacular wind, and being an island, we have a huge seabed. We're planning to see offshore wind become the base load. They call it variable base load going forward. And the belief is that Europe itself will use offshore wind as its major supply of energy, more than onshore wind, more than solar, more than gas, more than nuclear. But we can talk more about that. It's also far from shore relatively, and therefore harder to see. In fact, some of the projects are so far away that the curvature of the Earth means you couldn't see them even if you were looking for them. It's very acceptable. Onshore wind projects, typically 50% of them get cancelled by the consenting process. As you can see, we've had, what's that, something like 6% cancelled. That's pretty impressive. And then because it's not using fuel, it's not using loads of water, it doesn't create all the pollution that you get from fuels. Recent early days, it was expensive. We have to accept that. But that has come down to, as you can see, numbers on there. So it's a third of what it was a little while back. These dates are the installation dates. In fact, the latest auction, back end of 2019, we're now, bear in mind this is dollars, we're now down at £40 per megawatt hour, which is below the cost of wholesale electricity. It's below the cost of new build gas, and it's a third of the price of nuclear. So offshore wind becomes quite compelling at that stage. My focus is now taking offshore wind global because I think it's the right time. And that's where I've been lucky enough to advise, as Andrea says, a number of governments. Europe was the right place to start. Great wind, shallow waters. Now, big growth in Asia. China's moving rapidly as it does. US has been a bit slow, but it's going to move well this decade. And now we're talking with Latin America, India, and at some stage a bit more with Australasia. I should say on here, the red areas, bright red, is where the wind speed is pretty good for offshore wind and fixed foundations. The pink areas are where you put floating foundations, so beyond 50 meters water depth up to about 1,000. And if you add that all together, that is a huge resource. Only a proportion would get built, but we're talking about well over 1,000 gigawatts. These are huge numbers. So where we've got to date as a global market, as I say, I started off the left-hand side of the graph. It was very much a niche market at that time. And then Denmark started the very first project. Then the UK started to move, and the UK has been a leader and still is, because we've had such a stable policy that goes with this. And you can see how Europe has built out and has more recently, the graph goes up quite rapidly, bringing in China, as I mentioned. So we're at about 30 gigawatts at the moment, and the UK is a little over a third of that, which is pretty impressive. This is a graphic that Lindsay, my twin sister, brought to me, and she's online, so you can ask her questions about it. But essentially, people ask about what's the energy payback. And obviously, fossil fuels are inefficient, whether it's in a power station or in a petrol car. There's lots of heat wastage. And however, wind, you will get it paying back in 6 to 9 months. And therefore, everything after that is energy benefit. And that's what this graphic is showing. I was asked to pick up a few other topics that people like to ask, and one of them is, don't turbines kill birds? Yes, but not as much as an awful lot of other things. Cats, if any of you have cats, may know that they like killing birds, although they tend to be the small birds. A lot of them crash into windows. We have a garden room that I'm talking to you from now, and sadly 2 birds have died this year by crashing into our windows. We need to do something to stop that. But also vehicles and various other things. And so for every 1 turbine collision death with a bird, you've got 8,700 killed by other means. None of them are good, but just to get over the relative issue. That's not wind industry data, that's taken from the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Then the size of the turbines. So many of you will have seen the windmill at Lacey Green, which is on the left-hand side, and early projects.
Sorry, Alistair, you've stopped sharing your presentation if you were.
Oh, I managed that. What did
Yeah.
I click? Thank you for stopping me.
Thanks.
I must have clicked something. Try
Okay.
that.
You're back. Thank you.
Okay. So the size of turbines has dramatically changed from the beginning. The very first onshore turbines were built on farms, and in fact, one of probably the leading turbine manufacturer many, many years ago used to make tractors. Now they only make wind turbines. You can see the scale of those increasing over time. And onshore, we still have the largest turbines are perhaps 4 megawatts. That's still pretty big. It's the London Eye in scale. But offshore, I mentioned you can build a lot bigger. And part of the reason for onshore turbines being smaller is you've got to get them somewhere by road or by rail, whereas taking things by sea, it doesn't really matter how big it is. And the size of the turbine, so the length of the blade to the power output is a square relationship. So twice the size of turbine, 4 times the same amount of power. And the ones on the right-hand side are the ones that are being ordered at the moment, and we will go bigger. There are designs to do that. Just to explain how you put your wind farm in the right place, because part of the reason it doesn't kill birds is you don't build them where birds are. This is a simple green. Those would classically be bird areas because they tend to be nearer to shore, but there are some other areas further out which are probably sandbanks, because where it's shallow water, you get fish. Where you get fish, you get birds. Where you get birds, you don't want to build your wind farm. And then another sea user is for sand and gravel extraction, so to making cement particularly, for example. And that happens a lot around the UK as well. There will be shipping lanes. The wide blue ones are the ones down the channel, which are international maritime organization, effectively the motorways of the sea. And then the smaller blue ones are the more local vessels, but they are established in that way. And then one of the hardest to work with are the military constraints. So at the bottom there, you've got a shooting range, and then in the middle, there's probably an area for naval testing, or could be aircraft testing as well. So you would take all of these and quite a few others and put those together onto a single map. And from that, if you look very carefully, if you can see my cursor, you can see an area here with dotted lines around it. That was selected by the government as a place that people could come forward and put wind farms. And then that's exactly where they are. Some of them are built and some of them are in construction at the moment. So as with onshore wind farms, it's about putting them in the right place. I thought I'd show a few pictures about the stages of development. So site development, roughly say 3 years. Some of that is surveying the seabed, see how deep it is, find out if there is any unexploded ordnance, bombs from the Second World War, to find out what the seabed is made of. Birds we mentioned. Marine mammals, very important. This is a harbour porpoise. And I'm going to attempt to do another video if that's all right. So we'll have a look at, a lot of people are concerned about how marine mammals react to excuse me a moment. This is great fun having to switch between things. And I will just move that back. So this is an offshore wind farm off East Anglia called Sheringham Shoal, built a few years ago. And the red line is the tracking of a common seal. And each day, this particular seal goes out and you can see follows where the turbines are, because on the foundations, you've got an artificial reef. So you've got barnacles and mussels and a number of things it would seem that seals like. I won't do the full automation, but I'll take you forward towards the end. And you can see, I think this is over a 4-day period, something like that. This seal loves this wind farm. It goes and eats elsewhere, but you can see that there is an interaction. I'm not saying it's absolute proof, but I have to say I find this quite a beautiful video to watch. Right, let's stop sharing that and try and share that again. And then bottom right, you have a unit which is doing two things. It's measuring the wind speed using a form of radar, light radar, and it's also measuring the waves, currents. So this is the engineering data you need to build your wind farm. All of that information would go into an environmental impact assessment. That gives you your consent. If it's approved, then you need to finance the project and you can move into the construction and commissioning. And we're getting faster and faster at this, so which makes for better economics as well. In the middle, you've got the construction port we saw earlier. You've got the jack-up barge on the top right-hand corner, the substation bottom left, and then lots of cables. And the cabling is one of the most critical parts of the project, often misunderstood. And then you've got it built, you move to operations phase, and these are smaller ports. The vessel bottom left is what you call a crew transfer vessel. So if your project is, say, 15 miles from shore, you would use that to take the technicians out each day. You'll have top right an operations center with lots of sensors on the turbines themselves and also doing weather forecasting. And then if your project's a lot further from shore, you'd use a vessel like the one bottom right, which includes accommodation, which people could be on for 2 weeks at a time and then go back to shore for 2 weeks. So in that respect, it's got a lot of similarity with oil and gas. And we've taken a lot of techniques from the oil and gas industry. But it's not just about cheap power. Offshore wind and a number of renewables bring you with multiple benefits. Won't go through all of the ones along the top, but particularly attractive to countries is the economic benefits of new jobs and inward investment. And we're talking huge quantities. So an offshore wind farm, let's say 500 megawatts, which is not big these days, that's $1.5 billion. That brings with it a lot of jobs. And where are the jobs? So I won't go through the detail of this thing called the sector deal, but it's how government and the industry has agreed not just targets, but a whole process for this decade to get not only lower cost power, but all the other benefits that come from it. And 27,000 skilled jobs, which is very appreciated, especially because you've got the clusters around the old ports, which were fishing ports. So Grimsby was a very sad old fishing port. It's now a vibrant operations centre for those wind farms on the east coast. There are some others on the west coast in the small red areas, and there's one off the south coast at the moment. But certainly the North Sea is very, very popular. And the little purple dots are where the jobs are. So it's not just at the coast. You've got somebody who makes the crane that go on the bottom of the turbines to lift spares and repairs. They're around Manchester. The substation equipment, that's also around Manchester. Around Coventry, you've got people who are particularly good at gears and the transmission that you have in them. So I won't go through them all by any means, but the point is the jobs are actually quite spread out, and the same map in Germany looks very similar. And the deal originally was 30 gigawatts, but with Conservatives coming in to government, they actually topped that up to 40 gigawatts. So if you remember, we're just over 10 gigawatts now, and that took us 20 years. So to get to 40 gigawatts, we are going to have to motor, but we can. And it's going to be a very exciting time in the UK as well as around Europe and elsewhere. By the way, the Labour government were looking for 57 gigawatts, so it was a bit of a competition. Part of that will come from what is a new area in the market, which are floating foundations. So up to 50 meters water depth, fixed foundations, perfectly fine. Beyond that, you want to go to floating. There's 3 classic types, all of which come from oil and gas. As you can see, over 10 years of testing, Scotland has the largest. Some people call it wind farm. It's only 5 turbines, so we should really call it an array, but it's still a very impressive piece of work. And we are starting to see not only West Coast US and Japan, but also South Korea, Portugal, a number of places where the water is quite deep, quite quickly away from shore. This will treble the size of the market. So at the moment, more expensive than fixed foundations, but we believe that by the back end of this decade, the 2 technologies will start to compete. And I'm drawing to a close, you'll be pleased to hear. This is what we think is going to happen over this decade. So these are annual installations, as on the previous graph, and you see Europe expanding. As we've said, a large part of that is the UK, but also Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, France, Ireland, Poland, all sorts of people are joining the party. And then in Asia, which is one of the reasons I'm focusing there, China in the purple, but other countries, we've mentioned Japan, South Korea, but also a big one coming up is Vietnam, then the Philippines, India, Sri Lanka, there's an interesting market. And then the US, we believe, will kick off at scale at the second half of this decade, and a few others. But next decade, it gets even more exciting. So hold on to your hats. Offshore wind is moving very fast. And as I say, UK leads and therefore is able to export a lot of its knowledge and equipment. So I moved through that at speed because I was asked to, but we now move to questions and answers on offshore wind. And then I believe you'd like a discussion about what can I do in the space of climate action. I'm happy to talk to that as well. Right, I'm going to take a drink of water. Who wants to ask a question?
Thanks very much, Alistair. That was great. If anybody has any questions, they can either write them in the chat and I can read them out, or they can raise a hand and I will, and you can ask Alistair yourself. Mike.
Yeah, Alistair,
Sure.
is there anything you'd like to say about uses of the electricity in terms of things like making hydrogen or ammonia or interconnectivity, stuff like that, which, you know, things which would help to increase the utility of the electricity, if you like.
Absolutely. We'll start with the interconnectors, because at the end of this decade, 40 gigawatts, we're going to need on occasions to export some of that power. There are 9 interconnectors planned at the moment, and that will help, especially when we move to 2050, when we will be supplying a huge amount to Europe. The calculation that I did, it will be the scale that the oil and gas industry in the 70s and 80s in terms of balance of payments to the UK. So yes, interconnectors, very good. Then people in the last year, maybe 2, have got quite excited about what you could do with the excess power, because it's effectively free. And hydrogen is very high on that agenda. So there are different types of hydrogen. There's green hydrogen, which is from renewable sources. There's grey hydrogen, which is from fossil fuel sources. And then there's blue hydrogen, which is from fossil fuels, but you use carbon capture and storage. I'll have to say, I am not a believer in carbon capture and storage. I know people who've been working on it for 15 years and they still haven't managed to do it. But I won't get on that hobby horse just now. So the difficulty is that the cost of green hydrogen at the moment is about 6 times that of grey hydrogen. So there will be a transition. But there's a lot of people working hard on the green hydrogen agenda. And the bit that excites me is at that point, you don't need to connect to the grid. So we could move to where the wind is even stronger than the North Sea and turn it into hydrogen, put it onto ships and take it to market. But that's a little while yet.
Thanks, yeah.
Thanks. I've got some questions in the chat now that I'll read out to you. The first one is from Nicola. What happens at the end of life for the wind turbines?
Very good. So they're decommissioned. Firstly, it's part of the contract that the developer signs, and they have to have funds built up ready to do it. You essentially disassemble the way that you assembled. And the turbine, the transition piece can all just be lifted off and taken away. And then the monopile, there are techniques to unplug it from the sea, but the other way of doing it is to cut it off a meter below the seabed so that you leave a pristine seabed. We haven't got there yet, frankly, and there will be a discussion at that point that you've got these artificial reefs. Why do you want to get rid of them? That's what's happened in oil and gas, but they are completely removable. And the floating ones, even easier. You just pull out the anchors and take them away.
And what happens with the decommissioned turbine? Can the materials be recycled, or can it be used for something else?
So the vast majority of your turbine is steel and copper, all of which can be, so it's, I think, a little over 90% is just that. So that just goes into the standard steel recycling process. And there's quite a bit of work at the moment to get the blades. The blades are the problem for recycling. The old ones used to be fiberglass. They're now a little more complex, but the designs are going to include thermoplastic resins that you just melt and turn them back into something again. But at the moment, the blades aren't fully recyclable. There are techniques, you can turn them into insulation, and there's even in Rotterdam, there's a lovely kids playground made out of the turbines with holes drilled into it. But I have to say, we're not fully recyclable at the moment.
Thank you. The next question here is from Satnam Baines. Oh no, it's a question from Kim Price. When put in the sea, who owns the land and what permissions are required?
Very good. So that's why I didn't mention, so I worked 15 years at BP on low carbon. Then I went to the Crown Estate to lead the UK offshore wind programme. The reason being that the Crown Estate owns the seabed, or at least rights to the seabed. And in the UK, the developer will pay 2% of its gross income from selling electricity as a lease to the Crown Estate. Crown Estate is a public body, so all the money they make goes to Treasury and reduces your taxes, apparently. So instead of onshore, where you would pay a farmer a percentage of the revenue as a lease of the land, in the UK we use the same process for the seabed.
Thank you. That's great. Another question here from Charlotte Moss. What is the design life of an offshore wind farm array?
Very good. 30 years. So it used to be 25 years, but the ones going now are 30 years.
That's great. The next one here is, so that means that's the lifespan of an individual turbine, and is that the same thing?
Yes, that's the same thing. Yeah.
What is the what is the lifespan of a wind turbine offshore compared to onshore? Does the UK have patents on any parts? That's from D. Seymour.
Great question. So actually onshore turbines, at least theoretically, will only last about 25 years because the wind onshore is more turbulent. It gets knocked around by trees, buildings, hills, whereas offshore, you don't have that. So that's why I say it's stronger and straighter. And the thing that kills wind turbines is turbulence and fatigue loads. So actually, I mean, we don't have enough evidence yet, but it should be that offshore wind farms last that bit longer. And what was the other half of the question?
Does the UK have patents on any parts?
Sadly not, or not very much. We, as a nation, without naming any particular government, reduced research into all renewables by a factor of 20 in the 1980s. And we gave up the space to the Danes and the Germans. And they're the people that have all the patents. We do have a few, but not on the turbines and blades. It's on some of the other components and such.
Sort of tad short-sighted. But, okay, another question. This is from Terry. Is onshore really not worth the trouble? Can you see it increasing in future? I like the look of wind trees from France, but they do seem expensive, so will take time to repay the expense. So
if it wasn't for policy, the cheapest form of new power would be onshore wind. Solar's close, and then offshore wind has got really close, but not quite there. But the government, as of the last, what should we call it, 5 years, had a policy that they would not have onshore turbines in England. So they stopped providing the mechanism to allow you to sell power and they're from an onshore project, therefore they haven't been built. More have been built in Scotland where it is more windy, but I think it's later this year, the policy has changed. So all of a sudden there will be the ability for onshore wind farms to be built in England, but they'll still have to go through the full consenting process.
Does that answer your question, Terry? Yep. Okay. And from Jeanette here, are there any issues with the materials needed to make the turbines? Are there any shortages of materials?
Yes. So firstly, the steel needs to be really good quality. And I'm really sorry to say that British Steel don't make the quality of steel needed for turbines and monopiles, because you've got to bear in mind the diameter of these things, about 8 meters now, and the wall thickness maybe 3 inches. Just think how big that is and how, it's 1,000 tons. You've got to roll it and then weld the seal. That takes some equipment that hasn't been built yet. In the case of even the very high quality, and I'm sorry that happens to be Germany, those units haven't been built to do it, but they will be. And then copper, that's in short supply everywhere. And then in the you've also got some rare earth metals in. So there's 2 types of drive. You've got a geared drive and you've got what's called a direct drive. And the direct drive uses rare earth metals, of which there are worldwide shortages and plans for worldwide additional supply. That's quite a difficult topic if you follow the supply chain pack.
So is it possible that those rare earth metals and copper from decommissioned turbines can then be reused,
Oh, yes.
recycled? Yeah.
Absolutely. But because there is such a demand, I mean, it's not just wind turbines, it's your mobile phones, your television, all of those have rare earth metals in. So there's a lot of people going out to find it in Australia, all sorts of places. China at the moment holds the greatest supply.
Just while we're on that subject, with the sort of zero carbon, its green credentials, does that include the manufacture?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it does. Yeah, no, it's a full supply chain analysis.
Thank you. The next question I have is from Kim Price. Who makes money from offshore wind? Where are the incentives for industry and business? Should there be a set balance with nationalized? What do the different countries do in paying?
Okay, so it's an industry, it's capitalism. There's the lease to pay, there's the all the surveys and consultants to pay, then you get your consent, and then there's all the equipment to be bought, and everybody wants their margin out of that. And then the developer, who becomes a generator once it's built, he wants to make some money, otherwise they wouldn't do it in the first place. So it's a classic industrial structure. I think there was a hint in there about national or what we call local content requirements. You know, should we demand it's made in the UK? That's not how things are done in Europe. You know, that would be against trade rules. However, in Asia, they do. They all want to have the jobs, but they will get to a stage where they can't all have all the jobs, and it will form then a classic industry. But by doing that, they make the electricity more expensive because it's more difficult to build things.
Okay, great, thank you. Another one here from DC. What is the easiest answer for the shipping industry regarding power?
So I'm not an expert on shipping, but what I do know, I'll share with you. So at the moment, they burn bunker fuel, marine heavy fuel oil, effectively, very big emissions. There are designs for foils, a bit like wooden blades, to go onto vessels. We've seen some of those operating. There's a lovely design where they use kites, which is one of the next levels of technology, to pull the large vessels around. And then, of course, there's hydrogen. So there are a number of different, so the hard to decarbonize areas are shipping, aviation, and bits of industry. And if you can't turn it into electricity, there are now further options, but they haven't come to market yet.
I think there's a project in, is it Orkney, to replace their ferries by hydrogen-driven ones? Yeah.
Yes,
Which sound
and
very interesting.
It's often the island nations that are the most innovative, partly because they don't want to pay for diesel because they've got to import it from somewhere. So they're open to horrible prices. It's a very inefficient process, and therefore their substitution price is actually much higher. So yeah, places like Orkney are doing extremely well.
Great, thank you. What about Africa from Charlotte Moss? The map of wind resource and water depth looked okay. Is there any development expected there soon?
Great. I'm glad somebody's looking at the Global Wind Atlas and the bathymetry of Africa, which has been, basically that's the map behind me across the world. So Africa is late to the party at the moment. They're quite late on renewables, but they are doing wind and solar really well now, especially places like Morocco and things. We think they're one of the later markets, but we have a conversation going with South Africa, for example. They've got some great wind around the bottom of Africa. However, it's very deep water and there are very strong currents. So this is some engineering that hasn't quite been done. Every engineering challenge means cost. Doesn't mean you can't do it, just means it's going to cost you a bit more. But I would see Africa being really exciting. Also, I mentioned Morocco, but Tunisia, Namibia, but not across the middle of the, around the equator. The winds just aren't as strong. It's as you move away from the equator, they get to the more interesting speeds.
Great, thank you. A question from Jeanette. How long does it take to decommission offshore wind sites? What happens to the, oh, we've already kind of answered that about can they be recycled, but how long does it take to decommission them?
Depends on the size, but something like 1 to 2 years. As I say, it's just taking apart what you put together.
Yeah. Thank you. Another one from Keith Jackson. In order to suppress the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, it is estimated we need about 100 gigawatt per year from wind by 2030. Are we on target for that?
Wind total, no, we're not. I think we're about 60 gigawatts per annum installed. But as we move to 2030, yes. And as we get to 2050, if you can wait that long, then everything's looking very positive at the moment.
Thank you. From D. Seamer, can't you just replace the parts on the foundation of a turbine?
Well, instead of decommissioning?
Yeah.
So we've only actually had one wind farm fully decommissioned in Denmark. So there's a number of opinions out there, but certainly because of the scale of increase in turbine size, you may not be able to buy the same size turbine in 25 years' time. And the foundation was designed for a particular size. So I would think the most economic choice would be to take away the turbines. One thing you will know is everything about the wind, because you've got 25 years worth of wind resource, and you would find, I think at that scale, you would just redeploy in the same area.
So that means that you would have to be put. Does that do damage to the seabed, having to pull out those piles and put new ones in? I mean, how are they secured?
So as I mentioned, you could either cut them off below the seabed and leave it all, or you could pull them out. And yes, there will be some disturbance. It won't be nil, but bear in mind, as we said, they're a kilometre apart, and these are only 8 meters wide. It's not disastrous. But there are options. Do you extend the life of the project with clever maintenance techniques? Do you replace turbines on the same foundations, or do you take the foundations away and start again, which I think is the most likely, because as the turbines get bigger, you space them further out to prevent what's called wind shadow. So as we've seen onshore, particularly in places like Germany, they'll replace 15 small turbines with 3 huge turbines. It's just a different way of looking at it.
What's wind shadow, please?
So wind shadow, behind a wind turbine, you get a reduction in the wind speed because the energy is being taken out of it. So that's why you space out the turbines, so the wind can recover before it gets to the next turbine. Yeah, and that's why you don't see them all crammed together.
And so they're literally just hammered into the seabed. They're not sort of cemented in or anything like that.
There are different designs, but 90+% are simply hammered in. Depends on the seabed itself, and the water depth. So you might use what's called a jacket foundation. I've got a picture, but it'll probably take me ages to find it. But essentially, it's a bit like a pylon, and you pin the 4 corners to the seabed. There's another one which is just concrete, which you literally just plonk on the seabed. It's called a gravity-based system. So it's simply the weight of the concrete. But and then I mentioned floating, but the predominant number are the monopiles that you hammer in.
Okay, thank you. Right, next question. How is from Keith Jackson again, how is the environmental impact of mining rare earth elements for permanent magnets affected by the uptake of wind turbines?
So I'll give you an example of when it's not very pleasant being in the sector. So when I was managing the UK program, on a Monday morning, somebody rang me and said, "Do you like killing children in China?" And I just, I didn't know what he was on about. And he'd read an article in the Sunday Mail that said, permanent magnets require equipment from metals from China, where there's loads of pollution and the villages around are getting, the children are not enjoying the environment. And so I commissioned a study as to, is it just wind turbines? And the study found that no, the wind turbines are, let's call it 20% of the market. The vast majority come from mobile phones, televisions, other electronics. That doesn't mean we shouldn't, we still have a responsibility where the materials come from. And that's where the turbine manufacturers have got better and better at requesting, demanding, much better word, demanding they come from much better sourcing. But it has been a problem in the past.
Thank you. A few more, just 3 more questions left here. Is any damage done to the seabed in the site development stage?
Very minor. So you want to know what the seabed's made of. So you do 2 types of testing. One which is called a cone penetration test, where you put something on the seabed and sort of effectively hammer it and see what the response is. And then the other is you would drill boreholes to find out. I mean, these monopiles go down something like 30 meters. So you would drill down to find out whether it's sand, gravel, mud, sandy mud, gravelly mud. You wouldn't believe the different types of definition of what a seabed is, but it's essentially to do the engineering calculation on how secure your foundations would be. And actually, one of the leading companies in the world is only at Wallingford. So, that's where they commission a lot of this work, and it's a lot of the laboratories where they test all these things. So there's local stuff to us as well. But yeah, it's really minor effect on the seabed at that stage.
Thank you. From D. Seymour again, can any of the oil and gas fields in the North Sea be turned into wind farms? Exactly what does the carbon footprint include, i.e. minerals and recycling at the end?
So we've partially answered the last bit, but if we just take the oil and gas, the structures built for oil and gas were made for heavy weights, not for things 100+ meters with big blades and huge turning moments. So the platforms themselves are not suitable, but they could be suitable for substations, or they could be suitable for hydrogen production. As yet, nobody's done that, but there's no reason why not. And we're seeing in Norway, we're seeing projects where the electricity generated is used on the oil and gas station. So the 2 industries are sort of coming together a bit.
Great. And final question from Kim Price. How do you protect wind turbines in view of global terrorism, cutting the power lines as means of causing trouble?
Wow, we've got a terrorist in our midst, have we? No, it's a serious question, and particularly for cyber terrorism because of the control systems involved here. But a weird thing is that having 100 turbines, it's quite difficult to knock them all over compared to an oil refinery, for example. So actually where the gas comes into the UK, which is only sort of, I think 3 or 4 places, those are particularly exposed assets. And in fact, I did a little bit of work there to do with wind turbines. And I hadn't appreciated that the SAS have people allocated to those projects to prevent anybody coming anywhere near them. So far, we haven't had that problem, although I'm sure there are people who have assessed the risk, not myself, I admit.
That's great. That was all of those questions, Alistair, in the chat. I wondered whether we might be able to think about how this could help us locally in Watlington and how what we can do to enjoy the benefits of offshore wind here locally.
Very good. So major thing would be to buy renewable energy, electricity, or yeah, particularly electricity. So there are certain suppliers that only supply renewable electricity. The one that I've been with for well over 15 years is called Good Energy. There's another one called Ecotricity. And then I believe Octopus now supplies just renewables. And I believe Scottish Power claims to as well, but don't believe the nameplate. Go and check, because there was, when I was first looking, there were only 2 real suppliers, and there were another 13 who claimed to provide green tariffs, which were all sorts of different shades of green. But certainly it's now much easier and cheaper than it was.
I noticed on, I think it was it some of the backslides that you'd sent before, there was a graph of the different investors and developers of offshore wind. And I thought SSE, which is Scottish and Southern Electricity, was the second biggest investor developer. And that it's my understanding that is our local supplier, because Scottish Power bought up Southern Electric. I don't know if everybody knows, is aware. That was the default electricity supplier that we were connected to when we moved here.
So that probably wasn't, so Southern is south of London, if I recall, and obviously Scotland is further north, but the default when we moved in was Eastern Electricity. I think they've got another name now, but you can select any of them to supply. So, and you know, you're able to swap between them. It's just a matter of whether you want the cheapest or you particularly want renewables. So that, I think, would be your biggest impact. And then you start to move into the other renewables, whether you've got PV on the house. So we've gone for, I worked at BP, I got some shares, and when I left, I sold all the shares and put solar panels on the house. It seemed appropriate. But also an electric heat pump. Again, when we moved in, it was a coal-fired boiler. We converted it to oil at the time, and we've just got rid of it and put in a heat pump, which I have to say works extremely well. And then earlier this year, my wife's car needed replacing, so we went for an electric vehicle, and I have to say I'm really, really pleased with it. Yes, it's a different way of driving, but it's so quiet, it's so smooth. I think those are some of the big things that you could be doing on the power side. And then on the efficiency side, it's the classics. It's draft proofing, insulation, LED lights, and many, many other things. So it's partly about what electricity you buy and how you use it, and trying to reduce how much you use overall.
With the sort of local benefits of offshore wind, with all those purple dots of local jobs, and there being a major place in Wallingford, is that a parts production plant in Wallingford? What?
No, it's a survey specialist.
Survey specialist.
So they own loads and loads of vessels around the world. And what they used to do surveys for oil and gas, they now do surveys for offshore wind instead. And as I said, laboratories, consultancy. So yeah, if around here, if you've got family and friends who want jobs in London, there's loads of jobs to do with offshore wind, as well as a few, got various consultants out on the northwest of London as well. Places like King's Langley, for example.
Okay, that's great. Does anyone else have anything else? Terry?
Yes, I'm on the parish council as well as being on the WCAG group, and for years now I've been trying to arrange for some kind of community power renewables production, which in my head is would be a combination of ground source, air source, anaerobic, and wind and solar, all sort of feeding in, if you like, to a community power supply.
That's
Any
great.
advice? Any advice for that? Or?
Firstly, I would just go back in time to Denmark. So in Denmark, they made the decision not to have nuclear. They don't have any oil and gas. So they decided to go for wind. And each village put up their own wind turbine because they wanted to do their part for the nation. And it's a culturally different approach
Yes.
to the UK, but I would harness that approach and say, you can be part of it rather than be against it. And all the technologies you've talked about, yes, you'll have to do some economics, but it's whether people want to be part of the solution or not.
Yeah. And would you suggest, I mean, when I talk about wind turbines, I'm not necessarily talking about the big things that I think they're really artistic, but most people don't like them. Is there any point in having like small ones or medium-sized ones attached to, you know, each house having one or whatever?
So I did do a little bit on that a number of years ago, and yes, you can get units sort of about 2.5 kilowatts. But as soon as you attach it to a house, you've got an engineering issue. Be careful. Some of them are clearly not safe. I've seen the ones that they think you can fit to a chimney stack. Well, chimney stacks weren't built for wind turbines. So I'd be very, very careful. And then, but the agricultural size ones that you might see in some field, well, if you drive into Oxford on the right-hand side, there's a very nice scale turbine. If that wants to be at the back of your garden, that sort of thing. But the economics aren't as great as for the very large wind farms, frankly. But there's some delight in being part of the solution. It's not always just about the money.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
What with your just a quick word, Alistair, on your heat pump, what do you drive off that? Have you got an old house? Has it got radiators, or have you put in underfloor heating, or what?
So we've got a 1930s house
Right.
with radiators, and we ended up having to replace all the radiators because the flow temperature is lower. And so we've got thicker, or if you like, there's 2 columns to the radiator rather than 1. But because the guys who came to do it, we picked because they were very high quality, they reassessed all the heating in the house because our house has had 2 extensions. And now our house is more comfortable with the new system at lower temperature than it was with the old extended system at higher temperature. So heating is about quality of space. It's not just, again, about cost. So I'll go back to the old one, which is, do you put the radiator under the window or the other side of the room? And if you want to save money, you put it the other side of the room. If you want to be able to sit anywhere near the window, i.e. the space in your house, you put it underneath the window. Yes, it's not so efficient, but which is more important for you?
All right, there's another question here that someone's just added. Have you watched Michael Moore's film Planet of the Humans? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I have. I used to like Michael Moore because he used to rip into all sorts of other people. I'm sorry to say he's got it all wrong. It would be the simple answer. There might be no, essentially he's got off on a rant, and it's really sad to see.
And finally, there's another question here from Sophie Nelson. Was the Danish model whereby villages installed their own wind turbine imposed by the government?
Not at all. It was the, I don't know how much you've been to Denmark and know the Scandinavians. They have a behavior which I call, they behave as citizens rather than individuals. And they believe in their role in society. So it was perfectly voluntary, not government imposed.
Was it then funded by the government?
No.
No.
It's funded by the villagers. It's quite a remarkable, different way of thinking about things.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that's it. Someone else has said, I use Octopus, they're fantastic. Good Energy is also a good supplier. Yep. I think that's unless anyone else has any other questions, I think that might be a wrap. But that's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for the talk, and that was really informative. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
and
you.
we
It's
will-
been a pleasure.
yeah,
It's been
that's-
exhausting, but it's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
yeah, it's great. And we'll be sharing the recording of the meeting and as well as the lecture slides, so people can refer to those at some other point as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.
It's always fun trying to present to a different audience, so I like it.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Alistair. Much appreciated.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Bye, Mike.